Welcome to the Meat and Potatoes podcast. We're here with Chris Rogers, who's the territory sales manager for Blink Charging. How are you?
I'm good, thanks.
Appreciate you being here. I'm excited to talk about this because there's a lot to learn. It's already a huge industry, obviously, but still pretty new and ever evolving and ever changing. But let's start a little bit with Blink Charging. What is that? What is the company?
Blink Charging, we're the number 2 charging station in the country. We recently acquired SemiConnect. SemiConnect is where I began. And reason they acquired SemiConnect is because we develop and produce our own charging stations here in the United States. And they're made of aircraft quality aluminum. So we have a reputation for reliability, good customer service. So what Blink did, what SemiConnect did well, we came together, and it's really exciting. The merger's happening now, so talented team of people and building out the infrastructure so people can drive their EVs and adapt EVs easier.
Yeah.
So
it seems like that's the direction a lot of manufacturers are going, and a lot of people are going in their brains, which is the most important thing because they're the ones that are going to buy it, right?
Yep.
And you know, like I mentioned at the top, fairly new industry, right? In the early days of electrical vehicles, those friends that had them, they had to strategically think through things a little bit. I don't hear that anymore, right? And it's going to be less and less because there's going to be more and more. So where do you guys fit in that ecosystem? What is the process to ultimately connect America and enable a huge adoption of electric vehicles?
Yeah, I think you're right. There's a lot of noise in the industry right now. So a lot of what I do is educate people and try to kind of clarify what's needed, what's not needed. But the federal government is helping build out the EV infrastructure. They just released over $7 billion for the National Electrical Vehicle Infrastructure Program. So they're going to be installing DC fast chargers every 50 miles along the major interstates. And the federal government will be paying for 80% of that cost. The owner of the property will be paying for 20% of that. And then the Department of Transportations are responsible for qualifying the sites and dispersing the funds. So that'll happen in phases: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. So that's going to help a whole lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Couple of dumb questions. You could theoretically, and just prove me or say yes or no, if you had a big windmill and a charging station, you could charge through that. You could obviously charge from the grid.
Correct.
Solar.
Yep. I charge my EV on solar.
Very cool.
So it feels great.
So you're at your house?
Yeah, and I think about eventually 70 to 80% of charging will be done at people's homes.
Yeah.
So the local utilities are incentivizing both businesses and residents to install charging stations because they want to be able to access that data to help manage a grid.
Yeah. What kind of car do you have?
I leased a Chevrolet Bolt about 3 years ago, and that's how I got into this. I plugged in for the first time and realized I wanted to be part of this. So I feel really grateful to be part of that. The lease is about ready to come up. So there's a lot more options available. And if I were looking to lease or buy an EV, I'd probably still look at leasing because I think the technology is still going to improve. And there's some benefits, rebates for leasing versus buying.
Very cool.
But I love my Chevy Bolt. It's great.
It's fun, and it's probably quicker than a normal gas car, I would imagine.
Yeah, and it's an undercover fast car. You know, you expect a Tesla to be fast, but the Chevy Bolt doesn't look like it would be fast, so it catches people by surprise.
Yeah, and even if you're just barely paying attention, you would notice the mileage that the cars can go is increasing year over year.
Absolutely. And one thing I would mention, Hertz just purchased over 100,000 Teslas. So I think when people have the ability to rent an EV and experience an EV, that's going to help the adoption of EVs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And now there's pickups, right? I'm starting to see the Ford Lightnings. Obviously, Tesla's Cybertruck needs to come out. I'm on the waiting list for that. We'll see how that goes, but you don't want to bet against them.
No.
And soon enough there will be big trucks and semis and minivans and everything in between.
Well, yeah, the Amazon delivery trucks are already seeing those in the neighborhoods, which is nice. They're quieter, less emissions, and more delivery trucks like RC Willie.
Yeah.
They have some delivery trucks.
So this is all great for Blink, right? Because you guys are, in the old parlance, would be the gas station,
Yep.
right? And if there's more manufacturers and people buying these, there's going to be more need for Blink charging stations. So you mentioned you can do it at home. You can do it like at our office here. There's charging stations all over the place with Stack Real Estate. And then it sounds like with the federal government and all of that, there will be just along the highway.
Absolutely. And then something that can't be ignored is the local utilities rebates. And actually, the state of Utah right now will incentivize businesses. They'll pay up to 50% of their installation and equipment costs for installing charging stations. And then the utilities will incentivize people as well. So there's a lot of money between federal, state, and utility rebates.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So just as an example, let's just make this up. If you owned a grocery store and it was great and profitable and churned cash, and you wanted to build your own or pay Blink to build the charging station with no subsidies, nothing, you could just do that, right?
Yep.
If you wanted the subsidies and all that, you got to fill out a few forms and paperwork, I would imagine, but it really is that simple, right?
It is. Yeah. The utilities, they make it pretty easy to access those rebates. So
very cool.
Yeah.
So it could be any number of organizations or groups. Like there's no barrier to entry there.
No, there isn't. I mean, our biggest verticals are hotels, lodging, corporate centers, dealerships, cities, municipalities are our biggest verticals. Because if you have a multifamily development, people are EV drivers. They're going to go and live where they can charge.
Yeah.
And if they can't, they'll go somewhere else.
Yeah. And the ROI is probably pretty good to like, all right, fine, we'll build 10 of these because we need our tenants full, right?
Well, plus a lot of cities and states are making, if it's a new development, they're saying, hey, 20% of your parking spaces have to run conduit for EV charging stations. So they're also mandating that.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Continuing with the series of dumb questions. There's obviously like you've got a Chevy, there's Tesla, there's Mercedes, a lot of electric vehicles. When people go to the gas station, that nozzle works for every car. I assume that is the same for electric vehicles.
That's correct. Back in 2003, the automotive industry made the J1772 plug standard. Tesla does have a different plug, but they do have an adapter in their car to use the J1772. I just drove my first Tesla. I was in Oregon for work a couple weeks ago. And it's interesting, my Chevy Bolt, I didn't feel like the truck drivers messed with me because it was that undercover EV.
Yeah.
But when I was driving the Tesla, the truck drivers are like, oh, that's a Tesla, that's an EV. And I felt like a little bit of animosity in the Tesla. So that was an interesting thing.
Yeah, well, it's the most famous one for
Right.
sure.
Yeah.
All right. So with the increased mileage and like the people acknowledging that this is a great fit, the charging time needs to come down as well.
Yep.
So the R&D for you guys, like what are your goals is it like in 3 years, we'd love somebody to be in and out in 10 minutes. How does that work from a macro level?
I think that's a great question. And I was going to talk about that. Like my Chevy Bolt has a slower charging speed than a Tesla or a lot of the newer EVs. So what might take my Chevy Bolt an hour to do, these newer cars are having faster charging capacities. It's going to take them 20 minutes to do what my Bolt would do in an hour. So you do have different charging rates. For the last 10 years, the standard charging rate was for every hour you're plugged in, you get a 25 mile per hour range. I think it's still a good place to be for people who are going to be for a few hours. But now you're seeing 37 mile per hour charge rates, 75 mile per hour charge rates. And then the DC fast chargers, you'll get 100 miles in 30 minutes. And in the future, you might get 100 miles in 10 minutes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's just kind of the way technology works, right?
Yeah.
When our kids are charging their electric vehicles, it'll probably be half of what we're used to, I'd imagine, if
Yeah.
not better.
And if you're looking at charging at a public charging station, for less than $4, I get 75 miles. So you're doing better than the gas tank.
Yeah, for sure. Series of dumb questions continued. So you can charge your phone by plugging it in, or, they've got these things you just set it on, right? And it charges. I seem to remember there being something about that with cars. Is that a possibility? You just drive over something?
Yeah, there's actually a local company here in Salt Lake City. I think the name of the company is Wave. It could be wrong, but I met the gentleman, and he does have a wireless charging capacity where you just pull over, and then the car will charge wirelessly. But you're seeing that more with public transportation and electric buses.
Gotcha.
You probably see that eventually in residential, but definitely more from a public aspect.
Gotcha. And gas stations serve multiple purposes, right?
Sure.
You can splash and dash. You can go in and have a cup of coffee. You can hang out. Some of them have little restaurants. I've had a lot of fun at gas stations, right? Whether you're coming back from a trip or going on a trip, you're loading up on snacks. In small towns, it's fun to talk to the proprietor. And
Absolutely.
with gas stations, are they going to start phasing in a few electric spots? What is that process like?
Yeah, you're definitely going to start seeing that. I mean, they have to adapt. And I'd kind of like to see the gas station maybe evolve a little bit and get a little more sophisticated. It sounds like you kind of like the quirkiness of it a bit.
I do.
But I would like to see it evolve a little bit. But and there's a PlugShare app, which will go back to one of your earlier questions. So if you're driving from Salt Lake City to St. George, you're like, hey, I got a 250-mile range. I'm going to St. George. The PlugShare app will tell you where to charge along the way to make sure you don't get stranded on the side of the road.
Yeah.
So that's a nice app.
Yeah. And all you have to do is plan a little bit ahead, right?
Yeah.
Because this was before my time, but like my parents or grandparents, you had to do that with gas too,
That's
right?
true.
You had to.
Yeah.
I remember hearing stories of like, we ran out of gas and there's no cell phones. And, they used to carry like gas cans in their car, which I don't think many people do anymore. But if you were off, in some 1978 Caprice that got horrible gas mileage, you're gonna have to hitchhike a little bit.
Yeah.
I know it happened a lot. So it's like, it's not a new problem to have to plan your trips a little bit.
No, and one of the earliest adapters in installing charging stations was Walmart. Walmart has a lot of DC fast chargers, and they use the Electrify America money from the Volkswagen settlement to install charging stations. And I've stopped at some in Brigham City and charged. I'm like, well, I'll go get dinner here, or I'll go in Walmart and do some shopping when my car charges. So
Yeah.
it was a smart move.
Yeah. I've seen, there's some up in Yellowstone. I think it was, and there's some like in Rexburg at Bear World. But I'm not ashamed, gambling in Mesquite last summer at 3 a.m. and they had 50 or 60 charging stations.
Yeah.
And about half of the people were kind of in their cars. The other half were obviously inside gambling. So it's kind of a win-win. But it was really fun because there's a lot of people milling around and talking to each other. Where are you coming from? It's Montana, New Mexico. I think there's going to be some really cool stories of like friendships, possibly even like marriages, not marriages that day. But
You
I
never
think
know.
it's a
You're at
great
a
chance.
casino.
Yeah, you're in Nevada. But it was fun to watch their conversations, right? They were making new friends, and they might have been there half an hour to an hour. But I think that's like a cool byproduct. Again, maybe I'm a little bit quirky, but it was fun to watch those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely.
So with you guys, with the R&D, from concept to like having things out in the public domain, what does that look like?
Well, a lot of it is educating process, identifying what the property's needs are. And I'm not a huge proponent of buying more stations. I'm like, let's I'm a big proponent of installing conduit for additional expansion and demand because the installation process is usually the most expensive and the most time-consuming process. But let's start with these stations. Let's manage the end user's habits, and then as the demand increases, you already have the conduit laid. You just plug in a charging station. So we can do some power design stuff. If someone's looking to install 20 stations, we have to design the power for the grid to make sure panels don't break and stuff like that. So it's a lot of educating. Yeah.
Yeah. So with like gas stations, you'd have to dig a big pit for the main tank, and then the semi comes and fills it and
Yeah.
leaves. And there's spills and all of that. And reclamation. If you buy an old gas station, you're gonna have to pay to have that cleaned and scrubbed and all of those things. But with the charging stations, the construction outside of electrical engineering is probably a little bit simpler, right?
Yeah, typically just some trench work, lay some conduit, and maybe some concrete work. So pretty easy. If they can get the transformers and the things they need for the charging station. There's a massive back order for transformers. Sometimes they're a year out. So
Yeah.
kind of bottlenecks sometimes.
And that's probably going to be a recurring theme over the next 10 years of like supply chain and like demand fluctuating, not being able to meet it. How do you guys try to like look around these corners and see?
Well, we make the stuff in house,
Okay.
so that gives us a lot more freedom. We stock most of our charging stations, and one thing that's unique about us, not only do we make the charging stations in house, we also develop the software in house. Where sometimes other charging station companies source their charging stations from out of the country, put their name on it, and then they take software someone else has developed and take a station they didn't create, software they didn't create, and put it together. We do all that in-house, so it gives us a lot more flexibility as far as supply and demand. The DC fast chargers, the bigger units, those have longer lead times, 4 to 5 months.
Gotcha.
So
Yeah, because if you're on 10% battery and you show up and it doesn't work, my guess is you're not going to visit that one again.
well, yeah, I mean that's an issue as the EV industry is getting more popular. There's a lot of articles about the charging stations being down. Nationally, our downtime's less than 1% nationally, but a lot of that is this: whoever owns a charging station is kind of responsible for maintaining it, letting us know if there's an issue. We can do remote diagnostics to see what's going on with the charging station, but we strive at keeping our charging stations up. And if I go to a competitor's charging station and it's down, that bums me out too, because I can't charge and other people can't charge, and it affects the adoption of EV. So
Yeah, I imagine it's kind of a frenemies industry right now because you guys want everyone to like have good standards and make sure it works,
right,
or you'll all like suffer the negative consequences.
absolutely, yeah.
Dummy versus smart charging. What does that mean?
Yeah, so in the industry, what a dummy charger is to us is they cannot restrict access to the end user. They cannot send automatic text messages to the end user to manage their charging habits. They can't collect revenue. And typically they don't have cable management system. So what that means is the charging cords and the charging heads end up on the ground. So as an EV user, I come up, I get my hands dirty, I plug my car in. It's not a very good experience. So that's the biggest difference. So a lot of people are like, hey, I'll just install a charging station. I'll do the cheapest one. Like EV users don't really want to charge for free. They just want to use charging stations that are managed correctly and have the cords and the charging head off the ground.
Yeah.
So,
because it probably gets run over too.
yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned a little bit about some numbers as it pertained to like comparing it to a tank of gas. If you were going to charge, let's say it's a Tesla and it's at 10% at a Blink charging station, do you happen to know like what that would cost to get it full? Ballpark.
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends upon the owner of the charging station because they can set up their charge rates to whatever they want to. I have worked with some hospitality groups that have charging stations outside of Zion, Island Park, outside of Yellowstone. So they're going to charge a premium, and people are going to pay for it because they're out in the middle of nowhere and they want to go in the national park. But I would say on average, $25, I would guess. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a Subaru that I fill up, and it's about 60. So well under that.
Yeah.
Well under. That's an interesting point you just made that I was unaware of. You can kind of do a little bit of scalping, it sounds like, with that.
Well, that's part of it too. Our stations, you can be private or public information, which is also really critical, because if you're with a charging station where it must be public, these EV drivers are very savvy, and they're going to figure out where they can charge the cheapest. And they're using charging stations that might be for employees or tenants or guests at a hotel. So you want to be able to restrict access to those people so they don't come and get free charges.
Yeah.
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 And one more thing, the PlugShare app too, the end users can give reviews of the charging stations.
Okay.
So they can say, hey, this is broken, or this one's nice, but it's a little bit more expensive than the one down the street. So they kind of talk amongst each others to figure out the best place to charge.
I see. But if you had a private charging station and you knew for a fact, there wasn't another one within 100 miles, you could, if you were not very nice, you could charge as much as you wanted.
Absolutely. As long as people are paying.
Yeah.
That hospitality group, they knew that they had reviews that their charging stations were more expensive, but they're like, we don't care. People were using them and we're generating revenue, which typically isn't the case. It's not a big revenue producing product. It's more to attract people to your property or to your business.
Yeah. But the public ones obviously can't do that, I would assume. Like they have to keep it within a window, or
they're all unique.
Okay.
They can all do whatever they want, based on what makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I guess that's the same for gas stations. If you want to charge $10 a gallon, that's your prerogative.
Yeah.
Interesting. Is there any danger of adoption going too fast and the charging stations can't keep up?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there is. We were discussing earlier, the automotive dealers this time next year are collectively releasing 140 new EVs.
Yeah.
And, it's interesting about charging stations. I think people who install charging stations, and when I help people install charging stations, I really feel like we're agents of change, because more than 70% of people that have their driver's license are thinking about getting an EV.
Mm-hmm.
So once they have access to a charging station at work or in the community, their next car is going to be an EV. So that's what makes me feel good about what I do.
Yeah. I think I pulled these numbers from your website, and it was a report by Deloitte. 31 million EV cars by 2030, which is roughly 32% of all cars will be electric.
Yeah.
So you guys have your work cut out for you.
We do. And I kind of, right now I'm an EV driver, and I love that I can zoom around everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to miss these days, because pretty soon everyone's going to have EVs, and you can't just zoom around and go and do what you want to do.
Yeah, it is. Me driving the Subaru, I got to kind of plan my moves. But in a Tesla, you see a spot and you
just
can
go there.
for it.
Yeah.
Probably safer would be my guess.
Yeah, it is. It is. And they have that one gas pedal, which is really nice. It kind of acts like a golf cart.
Yeah.
You just press it down, and particularly in neighborhoods, press it down, accelerate, take your foot off. It just slows down, regenerates, and creates energy in the car. And that's what's great with the delivery trucks. They're quieter. They really make sense in the neighborhoods as far as kind of that golf cart driving capabilities.
Yeah. And we all have friends that are, left and right on the political spectrum. And, I've got my redneck cadre that, I'll talk about the environmental impact of it. And they'll be like, well, you're still getting the electricity from coal plants and all of this. But,
Hear that all the time.
And that might be the case a little bit, but you at your house is free from the sun,
Yeah.
and so that's not the case,
Yeah.
right? And then they'll talk about the batteries or
They're
environmentally damaging and all of that, but
they're finding better technology for the batteries, and when you look at the exhaust and the emissions of getting gas, refining gas, putting it on a ship, and like actually getting it to the gas station, the emissions are ridiculous.
Yeah.
And I remember about 12 years ago, I read this book and it was talking about the earth. And it said, the earth is going to take care of itself. And they're like, don't you think the earth put gas and oil deep in the crevice for a reason? And I was like, I had another one of those moments where I was like, oh, that's so right. So again, another reason I love being in this field. But something that came up to me is you're going to see electric school buses, which to me is super exciting because so much exhaust, so much noise. I'm really excited to see the electric school buses out there.
yeah, I think it'll be a lot of fun. And Formula One, they've got their hybrid cars, right?
Mm-hmm.
They've got electric, and there's a whole electric racing series, and so it's still way fun to watch. And I'm sure there's little apps or things you can put in your electric car to make it sound like a Dodge Charger if you wanted, I would assume.
Yeah. And I mean, Ford with the Mustang Mach, that's one of their legend cars, and it's electric now.
Yeah. And it's really cool looking.
Yeah.
That's the thing with these. I'm sure like the manufacturers, the engineers, the car designers are just having a heyday because they kind of get to redesign a lot of these things.
Oh, yeah.
Futuristic.
With different lights, you can set mood lighting in your cars. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Teslas that I've been in it's like, what doesn't this thing do, right? It's
pretty cool to
pretty
be
cool.
going 70 down the interstate and put your foot on the pedal and feel your back go into the seat at 70 miles an hour.
Yeah. That is reason enough. All right, what haven't we covered? We talked a little bit about rebates.
Talked about the NEVI program, dummy smart chargers. I think we kind of covered the basis a little bit,
Yeah. For those that are interested, so again, this could be, folks that own apartment complexes, folks that own retail, developers. What's the best way to engage with Blink and you in particular?
They can just email me or contact Blink, and they'll give them my contact information. My message would be, if you're thinking about installing charging stations, do your due diligence and do it right the first time, so you don't have to do it again.
Yeah, because I imagine you do it right the first time, you won't really have to worry about it for a long time.
And there's a lot of things to consider, something as simple as cable management system or restricting access. There's a lot of things to consider that people don't think about, that just take the time and do it right.
Yeah. Well, it'll be a fun industry to watch. And we didn't talk about, like, there's going to be political infighting and there will be debates on tax incentives and all of this. But I think everyone in general just roll with the punches, and best ideas will win.
Yeah, and it's something we discussed earlier before we got on the show is, people are generating revenue from these stations, so there's going to be different rules and mandates where they're going to start taxing the revenues of charging stations, and what that looks like. That's something that's coming up on the political front.
Yeah. Not shocking, right? If somebody's making money, then Uncle Sam's going to take a cut.
Well, one thing I'd like to mention, if we have time, I'm an EV driver, so for me to register my EV, it's $350 a year because they want those tax money that they're not getting from gas. But they did come out with something to track my EV, to track my mileage and my usage, so they could tax me based on my usage instead of that inflated number. So they're like, it'll never be as more than, but it could be less than if you let us put this thing in your car to track your mileage.
There you go.
And then tax me on that. So
yeah, it'll be fun to watch. This has been really fun. I was excited when you reached out because I wanted to get these stupid questions out of the way, and I'm glad you answered those. But it is what I thought, very fun and opportunistic, and I'm excited to see how the whole thing works out over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So thank you so much, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for giving me a platform to talk about what I love.
You bet.